Good morning and welcome. Thank you for coming today. I am Dan Cox. I'm a research fellow here at AEI, studying public opinion. Winston Churchill once famously said, "A lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can get its trousers on." That's actually not right. It was Mark Twain in 1919 who said, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes." That's not right either. It was Jonathan Swift writing in 1710 for the Examiner who said, "Falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it." The problem of misinformation and disinformation is not new in human society. We've been aware of this particular feature of public discourse for quite some time. When it comes to our elected leaders, we have come to expect a certain amount of deceit and duplicity. A recent Gallup poll that asked the public to rank the honesty of different professions found that members of Congress are perceived as being one of the most dishonest. They ranked next to last in terms of honesty, right above car salespeople and right above telemarketers. It's notable that confidence in sales professions is universally low, at least in the Gallup poll. It's also worth noting that unlike salespeople who are generally subject to some amount of legal restrictions when they're trying to sell you something, when it comes to politicians, they are not so constrained when they're trying to sell themselves. Next year, we will be collectively bombarded by about $10 billion worth of political advertisements. At a time of growing political polarization, historically low trust in many of our civic and political institutions, and a fractured media environment with limited gatekeeping ability, we are more vulnerable to misinformation than ever. Today we're going to hear about from some folks who are working in the trenches who are tasked with sifting through claims and counterclaims. Our aim today is to provide a better understanding of the fact-checking process, why it matters, and some obstacles faced by fact-checking efforts. A quick note on logistics. Before diving into our discussion, Professor David Barker will set the stage by walking us through some findings in his new book, One Nation, Two Realities, Dueling Facts in American Democracy. Dr. Barker is a professor of government and the director of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University. After David's presentation, each of the panelists will talk for about 5 minutes about their work. First up will be David Sivak. David is the chief copy editor at the Washington Examiner. He previously worked as a fact-check editor for the Daily Caller, where he helped launch the fact-checking program, Check Your Fact. Next up will be Angie Holland. Angie is the editor of PolitiFact. She previously served as the deputy editor and before that reporter, helping launch the site in 2007. She was a member of the PolitiFact team that won the Pulitzer Prize for its coverage in the 2008 election. And finally, we'll hear from Glenn Kessler. Glenn has been the editor and chief writer for the Fact Checker at the Washington Post since 2011. He has covered foreign policy, economic policy, the White House, Congress, politics, airline safety, and the Wall Street during his career. He served as the Washington Post chief State Department reporter for 9 years. Before that, he covered tax and budget policy for the Washington Post and also served as the newspaper's national business editor. I'm delighted to have them all here and look forward to our discussion, but first, let's hear from Dr. Barker. David.
All right, good morning. Good to see all of you this morning. So if I just do this, it's going to pull it up. Yeah, there we go. All right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about our book, One Nation, Two Realities. And so a lot of you here are familiar with or remember this guy, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who had been a political scientist as well. He famously said that you are entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. The problem with this is that there is actually no hard evidence that he ever actually said that. The statement is itself apocryphal or perhaps an example of fake news. Nevertheless, we also in this book argue that perhaps he was wrong, at least as it applies to American politics in the recent past, because increasingly it seems that Americans do believe they are entitled to their own facts and believe entirely separate things depending on their partisan persuasion or where they live. And so what I'm going to talk about here today is just a little bit first about some of the consequences of these dueling fact perceptions, right? Why it matters, and also just a little bit about what exactly we're talking about, because the problem, in our view, goes beyond just misinformation or misperception. Then we're going to talk a little bit about sort of how we got here or why, what specifically are the drivers of these dueling fact perceptions or motivated fact perceptions. And then a little bit about what might be done about it, which is going to segue into our discussion with our fact checkers here. And what I'm going to focus on, frankly, is how difficult their job is in light of human psychology. So, as we all know, right, and I just alluded to this, and so did Dan, one of the primary consequences of a dueling fact perception environment is, of course, misperceptions and misinformation. And this is one example, of course, as it relates to vaccines, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens that we could point to, and many that we review in our book about the percentage of Americans who believe things that are ostensibly untrue according to the best available evidence. However, as I said, that's not the end of the story. We also talk about something that we refer to as epistemic or intellectual hubris. In other words, while there are lots of facts, yes, there are things that we know pretty much for sure that a lot of people get wrong. There are also a lot of things, especially as they relate to public policy debates, where the evidence is significantly more blurry. The experts disagree, it's unclear, it's a little bit subject to interpretation. Again, the evidence goes back and forth depending on the data. And yet, increasingly, what we observe in our book over time, Americans are inclined to be certain, to be sure, to be absolutely sure that what they think is true, say, for example, with respect to the relationship between tax rates and economic growth, or the role of free trade and the degree to which free trade helps or hurts American workers, or the degree to which the minimum wage, for example, helps or hurts American workers, or the economic consequences of undocumented immigration. There are lots of things that people think that they know for sure, that it turns out that there's no reason they should know that, or think that they know that for sure, because there isn't much great evidence on it. And so this is another problem, this hubris. There's a third thing, actually, that I want to mention before that, which is the corollary to hubris, which is what you might call rampant cynicism or even nihilism that we find ourselves in today. So while lots of people have unwarranted certainty, another big group of Americans, and in some sense, sometimes it's the same people, are convinced that there's no way that we can really know anything anymore anyway. You can't trust any of the sources of informational authority. Everybody's biased, you can't know, and so forget it, we're just gonna believe what we want, right? And it's this post-truth dynamic that many observers have referred to that is also something that we're dealing with right now. All right, so what, right? Who cares? What does this mean for democracy? First of all, I think everybody in here probably knows this one, which is that when people can't agree, right, on what the basic facts are during a political deliberation, then our deliberation suffers. And indeed, our vision of a so-called marketplace of ideas in American democracy winds up evaporating, right? So we no longer have, many would argue, a marketplace of ideas where the best, where people sit down and deliberate and hash it out and based on reason and evidence, and the best ideas rise to the top, right? This is what's supposed to happen in a democracy. It's been replaced by a marketplace of realities, right? And perhaps a flea market of ideas, right? Where ideas don't compete based on reason and evidence, but rather on flash and whatever's cheapest, right? And so this changes the whole idea of what a democracy even is. From this idea where everybody is getting together and deciding collectively on what's going to be best for the collective, right? Instead, into a Hobbesian, Lord of the Flies-esque vision of group interests and identity politics just battling out over who gets what, when, where. More of a scrum than a deliberation. Secondly, misinformation and hubris and these dueling fact perceptions that I'm talking about weaken accountability, right? If people can't agree on what just happened, right, then you can't hold your elected representatives accountable for what they've done, right? And there's some evidence right now that for the first time in modern American history, since we've been doing polling and studying this kind of stuff, that in 2020, the relationship between economic performance and people's willingness to support Trump for a second term may be effectively zero, right? And that's not to say that presidents are responsible for economic policy to a very significant extent in a capitalist democracy, especially an international capitalist system. But it is one version that Americans have traditionally relied on to decide whether or not they wanted to give their presidents a second term or not. And historically, there's a very, very close relationship between economic growth and presidential approval, and therefore presidential reelection rates. It appears there's virtually no relationship now between economic growth and presidential approval. And so again, it weakens the degree to which people can hold officials accountable. The third thing that you probably haven't thought about is that this dueling fact perception environment, this polarized factual environment that we're in, invites social contempt, right? So aside from the consequences to democracy that I've been talking about, there are the broader social consequences that we delineate in the book. And so what do I mean when I talk about social contempt? Well, a lot of you are familiar with Arthur Brooks's work that distinguishes anger from contempt and its relationship to how democracies function. And he, famously argues that polarization is not necessarily bad if it's about anger, because anger is activating. Right? Anger leads people, and this is true in marriages and all kinds of personal relationships too. When you're angry at somebody, but you're coming to them from a position of respect, you can hash things out, you can argue, you can debate, and you can reach some resolution. Contempt is different. Contempt is the collective eye roll. Contempt is when you give up on somebody, right? The people who study marriages, right, say that they can tell if a couple is going to get divorced within 15 seconds or something like that based on their body language and whether they have folded arms and rolled eyes, and it has nothing to do with anger. But when you have contempt for the other, you give up on them, you quit, you disengage, again, which is anathema to democracy. And so how did we look at this? This is an example, a frame from an experiment that we ran where we made up this guy, Bob Stratford, right, which is the most milquetoast name that we could think of, and have an equally milquetoast picture there of him. And we invented a hypothetical Twitter page for him. And we subjected our experimental subjects to this Twitter page, mixed in with him saying some equally sort of benign things as they relate to the Beatles and Downton Abbey. And then manipulated the thing in the middle. And this is one example, just one frame of many different experiments we did, where we manipulated whether Bob was either denying climate change or affirming it. And then in different experiments, we did it as it relates to the prevalence of racism in society, the minimum wage, trade, immigration. We did this several different times, right, where we manipulated Bob in either making a controversial factual statement, right, in relation to these issues on one side or the other. And then we wanted to see how people who were exposed to him would react. And as you can see, even the statement here, right, it's not exactly outlandish, right? It's pretty bland. But what we observed, actually, I don't have a slide for what we observed, but I'll just tell you, is that on both sides, right, among both Democrats and Republicans, when they observed Bob saying something that was factually different than what they tended to believe, they tended to dramatically reduce their willingness to view him as an intelligent person, reduce their willingness to say that they would have lunch with him at work. They would be willing to, they declined in terms of their willingness to work with him on a project if he was a coworker of theirs. And this was different than when we exposed them to him saying things that were just of a partisan nature, right? Because we also had versions of this experiment where we had him just like cheerleading basically for the Democrats or Republicans, right? Or for liberalism or conservatism, which prompted anger in some cases, but not necessarily contempt in the same way that these factual statements did when people disagreed with them. Okay. So the question is why? I usually get a better reaction from the cat, from my audience, right? I've always been told that like people like videos and pictures of cats. So anyway, so this is a two-part story, and one is the is the version that maybe is a little bit more relevant to our conversation today, but we ultimately argue is not the central part of the story. So the first part of the story here is about declining trust in every social institution in American society, but perhaps especially declining trust in the traditional sources of informational authority, whether those be the mainstream media or universities and scientists, right? We've seen a steady decline in polls of the percentage of Americans who say that they trust universities and scientists to be honest and objective brokers of opinion. They've been saying that with respect to mainstream media also for a long time. So this decline in trust of informational authority has led, of course, to partisan media, right, which starting about 20 years ago sort of took over the marketplace and changed our media marketplace from one that was characterized primarily in terms of broadcasting to one that was or is characterized primarily in terms of narrowcasting to try to capture a particular audience as opposed to trying to capture a broad audience. But that's only part of the story. If we were not inclined to want to believe the things that the propagandists are telling us, it wouldn't work, right? And indeed, there's a long history of research in communication and in political science that shows that type of propaganda effects, like strict media effects in terms of changing people's minds and convincing them that something is true and they don't want to believe that it's true, rarely works. Those sorts of effects are minimal, right? For propaganda to work on us, it has to be consistent with stuff that we already believe is true, right, or want to believe is true. And it's this dynamic of motivated reasoning that the psychologists talk about, right? Almost nobody, even if we want to, even if we try, human beings are not really capable. We're not hardwired to objectively evaluate all the facts of a given situation and then come to decisions, for example, in terms of what kind of policies we might support, based on what we consider to be the objective evidence. We tend to do the exact opposite, right? We reach conclusions about the policy prescriptions that we prefer, and then we go looking for evidence to back up what we already believe, right? And so the question then is, okay, if it's motivated reasoning, then what are the motivators? Are we talking about strict knee-jerk partisanship, right? And there has been this, political scientists at least talk a lot about partisanship as an identity now, and the degree to which partisanship is no longer just about a preference of which party you prefer, but a deep-seated, deeply rooted identity in the same way that race or gender or religion is, right? And so people attach to these parties, and then whatever those parties say, like, we'll change our minds, we'll flip our positions, and the whole partisanship is a hell of a drug line. And so we wanted to find out the degree to which that is the culprit here, sort of knee-jerk partisanship versus value projection. And so I'm going to quickly run through some more of these things. And just the first thing here to say is that values, and some of you are familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work. He's been here and talked to you guys. We find that the differences in terms of deep-seated core values are the things that tend to drive people's perceptions of reality. And the reason why it's worse now than it used to be is because the culture wars are worse now than they used to be, right? And so a couple other points. First of all, lots of people have hoped that through education we could solve this problem or make it better. Our evidence suggests precisely the opposite, that the most educated among us are the ones who are most inclined to project their values onto their facts. They're most guilty of motivated reasoning. Education is bad in this sense. Lots of other people, especially like in my world, tend to view this as a problem that's primarily restricted to the ideological right. And some of you might remember this. That was out there during the 2016 campaign where Trump supposedly told People magazine in 1998 that he would run as a Republican someday if he were to run because Republicans are a bunch of dolts, right? And most of my university friends all saw this on social media and believed it was true. That's of course an example of fake news that I believe the fact checkers to my right pointed out. And more broadly in our research, we find that this is a problem on both the left and the right in roughly equal measure. And then the final thing I want to say is, going back here, what can we do? This is the answer, right? And so we're going to be talking about fact-checking. Our evidence and a lot of other evidence from communication and political science indicates that the ability of these fact-checkers who do yeoman's work to actually correct people's misperceptions and set them on the right path tends to be extremely limited. We did find, however, one example where there's some hope. So we actually partnered with PolitiFact when I used to be in California on a project where we exposed people to this PolitiFact graphic at the end of the 2016 primary contest. And without getting into all the details, right, this sort of shows that over the course of the previous 2 years on PolitiFact, Hillary Clinton's statements had been judged on average as equal to or perhaps slightly more truthful, right, than Bernie Sanders's. And then we wanted to actually look and see if then Bernie Sanders supporters would take that information and update and tend to view her as more honest than they previously had, right? And we also did it with Clinton supporters and Republicans and everybody else. And we expected everybody to reject this information, but we thought, well, maybe, right, in the intra-partisan context, right, maybe other Democrats who happen to support Sanders, maybe they would come to view Clinton more favorably. And that is what we observed. So if you look at these bars, the one to really look at is the Sanders supporters, and those are the only ones where the lines don't overlap, suggesting that, again, over time, without getting into all the details here, Sanders supporters did change their mind. They updated their perceptions of Clinton's trustworthiness based on being exposed to this information relative to those who were not exposed to that information. So we think that this, again, provides some hope for the future. For example, if we can get folks on Fox News, right, if, I was going to say Shepard Smith as an outdated reference. If we can get, Chris Wallace or Brett Baer or other folks on Fox to fact-check Republicans, then maybe Republicans will believe that, right? And similarly, if Rachel Maddow fact-checks Elizabeth Warren, maybe Democrats will trust her. And so we have some hope that there's a future efficacy for fact-checking in that way. Thank you very much for your time.
David?
My name's David Sivak. I spent several years at the Daily Caller, where we actually built a new fact-checking outlet called Check Your Fact. So I started there as a reporter. After a time, I actually became the editor there. And so I had my hand in both writing fact checks and overseeing the process of fact checks being written. And part of why we're here today is to kind of talk through with you guys the process of how a fact check is written, how we go about finding a claim, how we determine a verdict, just the general process. And so I'd say it generally starts with being very plugged into the news. So we would commonly have our cable news networks on. We have this tool called TweetDeck. Twitter has a great ability to allow you to see, type in keywords and have streams of different content. Look for keywords, look at different groups of politicians. You could look at the Progressive Caucus, the House Freedom Caucus, right and left. And really what we try to do is we try to stay plugged into, we try to be relevant to what was in the news cycle. So if immigration was in the news, if it was the GOP tax cut, if it was impeachment, we would be plugged into whatever the narratives are that we saw developing. So as we watched pundits go on the cable news networks, what kind of talking points were they making? We would also focus on, instead of just watching and kind of passively absorbing, there are influencers in politics. You know, there are major figures who have large followings on social media. So just staying plugged into what they're saying, looking for stats, looking for claims. Now, we'd stay away from our value judgments or opinions. We'd really be honing in on things. There's the narrative, and then there are the claims underneath the narrative that kind of people use to bolster that narrative. So we'd be looking for what was underneath the surface of that narrative. We'd find a claim, and we'd do some preliminary research on it. At the Daily Caller, what was important was our rating system was a bit rigid. We had true, false, and unsubstantiated. So there's less of a gradient. So we'd really be honing in on things that we felt were demonstrably true or demonstrably false, or were just so exaggerated that we felt like we were comfortable assigning a false rating to it. And the tricky thing about fact checking is sometimes people will switch up the words they use, and it can alter the verdict. It can alter the rating. They can say things more carefully, more cavalierly. And so as a matter of credibility, we felt like we didn't want to wade into the gray area. And so it's a hard task being a fact checker. And so we just felt we wanted to stay in safer waters and rely on things that were true or false. We also had an unsubstantiated rating, which were things that had yet to be proven or there wasn't a lot of data on it. And so the verdict is a very dicey thing. I say it's one of the hardest things that fact checkers have to grapple with, is assigning a rating to something, especially when you're making a judgment call whether something is, sometimes the spirit of what they're saying is true, or maybe they're close to the number. And so being able to find a clean claim that you can fact check is important. And so we would kind of scan both social media and the cable news networks, or wherever people are out there making claims. We'd find something that our preliminary research would say was clean enough for our rating system. And then we were really careful about, we didn't want to, especially with more complicated fact checks, sometimes things are very straightforward and simple. Sometimes a politician will say, my record was X, and you can look back at news articles or their voting record and see that it was actually Y. There are some things that are way more nuanced, and I'd say the majority of our work is more nuanced because in a way, we become subject matter experts on a different topic practically every single day. And so one day you might be covering wage growth, another day you might be covering immigration, another day after that some legal question. And so being able to dive in isn't always so easy. And so the first step, a lot of the time, since we're not experts on it, is relying on reputable sources. We'll be going to think tanks, we'll be going to government studies that have been published. We would go to, one of the chief things we do early on is canvass experts, find professors, think tank experts, people who actually study what we're looking to cover. And canvassing is actually very important, meaning sending out emails, reaching out, making phone calls to a lot of people, because either somebody won't get back to you, but more likely the case is you might find competing perspectives. It may not shift your verdict, but maybe you'll have different voices in your piece. And that's another thing. Is so once you've reached out to experts, we try to really make sure that verdict is ironclad. So if it's something that's very gray and murky, we might hold off on writing it until we felt like we had a better sense of whether it was true or not. Because what we try to do is we try to avoid nitpicking politicians. We try to avoid claims where the wording is ambiguous. And so because the Daily Caller's rating system is a bit more rigid, we'd have to stay away from things that didn't kind of cleanly fall into one verdict. And so once we establish a rating, though, the most important thing to us is a lot of times fact checks end up being, they're kind of quasi-explainer pieces. A lot of times you're educating the reader on a certain topic, along with, it's almost as though fact checks are a springboard to educate it. So if immigration is, for example, what's being debated on the national stage, someone might make a claim, and that claim is a springboard to talking more broadly about that issue. How many undocumented immigrants are in the country, that sort of a thing. And so what's important is making sure that you're being very thorough in your research. You might find studies that contradict what you thought the verdict was initially. So reaching out to a lot of people helps. Being thorough helps you avoid the pitfalls, because fact checking is very perilous in the sense that if you get a verdict wrong, people kind of they'll assign bias to it. They'll assign that there was a motive behind that. And so what we were very careful to do is make sure that those verdicts were ironclad, that we had very thoroughly researched the topic, that there was not only anything missing that could undermine the verdict, the pieces themselves were balanced. And so we would often include, big emphasis was making sure that we had different voices in the piece. So if something was true, but we would want to make sure we encapsulated that in the piece. Finally, I guess I would just say,
sometimes you'll get into a situation where the claim is wrong, but perhaps this, you could argue the spirit of the claim in some sense is true. For example, people will oftentimes just pick poor examples of something. And so we had fact-checked Newt Gingrich as false. He had said there were 180 million Latin Americans who wanted to come to the United States. He was relying on a Gallup poll. It turns out the number is actually closer to 30 million. And so that's wildly off. The number is wildly off the 180 he had cited. But for balance, we wanted to make sure we included in the piece the fact that that same Gallup study talked about how 30% of Hondurans want to come to the United States. A quarter of Salvadorans want to come to the United States. 1 in 5, different, Central American countries. But while the claim had been greatly exaggerated, there's some grain of truth. So trying to make sure that we're not leaving out context or something important is necessary to build credibility so that your readers, when they view your fact check, they feel like you've given somebody a fair shake. And so on both the left and the right, you have to always be looking for the true but or the balance points, or make sure you have all perspectives represented in your piece.
Great. Angie.
I'm Angie Holan. I'm the editor of PolitiFact. I've been with the site since it started in 2007, and we've published just over 14,000 fact checks. So I've seen a lot of fact checking over these past more than 10 years. I really enjoyed the presentation today. It really squares a lot with the things that I've observed during this time. For us, we started as an election year project at Florida's largest daily newspaper, the Tampa Bay Times. And the project, it was online, it's fact-checking, it's database driven. We're the home of the Truthometer, so we have ratings that go from true to mostly true to half true, mostly false, false, and pants on fire. So we publish new fact checks every day on our website. We have a daily email newsletter as well as a weekly email newsletter. We still publish our content in the Tampa Bay Times newspaper, and we have other partner news organizations that we work with, the Austin American-Statesman newspaper, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. We work with NPR affiliates in Richmond and Sacramento and other news organizations around the country. As our mission grew, our fact-checking proved extremely popular. We became a full-time fact-checking project, not just for election years. And approximately 2 years ago, we moved to the Poynter Institute, a nonprofit school for journalists and a research center. And we've been at the Poynter Institute continuing our fact-checking work, but also expanding into media literacy efforts. The fact-checking project in itself is very much rooted in American journalism that is seeking to give people the information they need to govern themselves in a democracy. We started in 2007 very much as a reaction against journalism that had a couple of different failings. One of the failings was an obsession with the horse race. We felt that issues weren't being covered enough during election years, that the candidates' speeches and advertisements weren't being vetted thoroughly enough, that there was too much discussion on superficial aspects of the candidate's presentation, and frankly, just like who was up or down at the moment as we approached Election Day. So we wanted to see more substantive policy coverage. We also felt that journalists had gotten into a mode of what we call he said, she said journalism, where they were simply presenting the talking points of both sides without doing any sort of adjudication of the claims and saying which side had the better part of the argument. And now there are certainly complicated cases where you can't say, but we felt like journalists were taking a pass even when they could say. And we felt like that was not in service to the readers who need to be informed as they go about making their decisions. Our fact-checking tends to focus on policy issues, healthcare, the economy. We also do foreign policy. We fact-check a lot of things about candidate biographies. We fact-check attacks on the candidates make on each other. In recent years, we have expanded into debunking misinformation. PolitiFact is one of the partners with Facebook in their third-party fact-checking project. And with that project, we debunk a lot of hoax and conspiracy theory content on the internet. Now, I will say this kind of content existed before the social media platforms grew. In 2007, we were fact-checking chain emails, which are these all-caps emails, forward this to everyone you know. The new fact-checking on the social platforms is very much a piece with that. Today, as a journalist, as a fact-checking journalist, I feel like our project is more valuable than ever. I feel that we are staking a claim for journalism as a truth-seeking endeavor, not as a way to legitimate those who hold power or to legitimate a particular ideology. We are, through our reports, we write about how we arrive at our conclusions, we cite evidence. This process is meant to really preserve the truth-seeking process, and that there are things that are knowable. The post-truth world where nobody can really tell what's real, what's not, I think that's a very dangerous ideology that breeds a lot of cynicism, and it seems particularly at odds with a deliberative democracy. So that's where I see our work today. Thank you.
So I'm Glenn Kessler. I'm editor and chief writer of the Washington Post Fact Checker. The Washington Post Fact Checker also started in 2007. It was intended just for the election year, and it went on hiatus until the Washington Post asked me to revive it in 2011. They did so in part because they saw that people were still reading the old fact checks, and they were getting a lot of traffic. They asked me to do it. I had covered just about every building in Washington, and I had also pioneered fact-checking. I believe I wrote the very first fact-checking article for American newspaper in 1996 when I was chief political correspondent for Newsday. And it was born out of my frustration of covering what these guys were saying on the road all the time, and every time I tried to point out that what they were saying was wrong, it got cut for space. So I convinced the editors to give me a platform for the first debate between Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, laying out exactly what was right and what was wrong about what they were saying and what readers would be hearing that night on the TV. The Fact Checker is at heart a policy column. We use it to look in depth at complex policy issues. We look for claims that are in the news. So if there's a gun shooting, we might do lots of gun fact checks. If there's suddenly a effort to terminate Obamacare, we're going to do lots of healthcare fact checks. It's less important who said the statement to us than whether it serves as an entree to write about a deeply interesting subject. And that very policy-oriented focus led us actually to create the database of false and misleading claims made by President Trump, because frankly, a lot of the things the president says can be fact-checked in very few words. So I said, hey, we won't waste our time on these inconsequential things the president's saying. We're just going to put it in a database, and therefore we can really focus in depth on the thing that the fact checker is known for. It's our policy focus. We didn't quite realize the president would end up saying so many false or misleading things. So the database has become an all-consuming enterprise in addition to our day job, which is writing detailed fact checks.
What's the number up to?
It's up to 13,435. On average, he's been averaging about 20 to 22 false or misleading claims a day. So that's what we do on weekends and at night. So we're intended as a complement, not as a supplement to the political coverage of the Washington Post. The big difference is that we make judgments about the veracity of claims made by politicians. We do that with a Pinocchio scale. The worst is 4 Pinocchios, which is a whopper. Our 3 Pinocchios is kind of like PolitiFact's mostly false. 2 Pinocchios is kind of half true. 1 Pinocchio means they got a little bit off. in the ballpark. We also have something called the Geppetto check mark. That we reserve for claims that are unexpectedly true. And so it's where you see it, can that possibly be true? And it turns out it is. So then we'll say, okay, we'll do a fact check on it, and we'll give it a Geppetto check mark. We don't try to play gotcha with the Pinocchios. I mean, everyone hates the Pinocchios. We get so much grief about the Pinocchios, and we spend a lot of time trying to adjudicate it. But if a politician comes to us and says, I messed up, I didn't really intend to say that, or I admit I am wrong, we will still do the fact check, but we're not going to award the Pinocchios. Now, it's interesting, in the past, very few politicians took us up on that offer. There was a very prominent member of the House who thought about it for a day and came back and said, yeah, even though I messed up on Meet the Press, I'd rather take the Pinocchios than admit I was wrong. Lately, we've seen, particularly with the Democrats running for president, they're more eager to say I messed up. There was an instance recently where Joe Biden had said that he was against the Iraq War from the very beginning. When I went to the staff and said, here's my documentation, this looks pretty bad, they actually, even though they've been defending it up to that point, they came back to me and said, we will admit he made a mistake and he was wrong, and he's going to go out and say this publicly. Please, can we not have Pinocchios? So the Pinocchios, I've always said, is a marketing gimmick. It's intended to just give a brief summary of our bottom line. It is subjective. I have to admit that. My two Pinocchios might not be someone else's two Pinocchios, but I believe we've been internally consistent as long as I've been running the fact checker. So that is about as scientific as I can get to it. But it's it's just a way. We're in the newspaper business. We want people to read what we write, and the Pinocchios is a way to catch people's attention. There's my 5 minutes is up. There is a video on the Washington Post website at the About the Fact Checker page, which actually explains our process in detail, and you could learn more about how we do our jobs. And video has become a big part of what we do with a fact checker. There's myself, there's another reporter, and we now have 2 video producers. Because frankly, we have more viewers of our videos than readers of our fact checks. About 5 times more people watch our videos than read the actual fact checks. And sometimes the scale is off more than that. We had a video last year that had 8 million views. And the actual fact check that was the basis for that video had 1 million unique visitors. So that was 8 times. So we try to reach readers in as many possible ways as we can to basically try to inform them about policy issues. And so video we have found is a really effective way to do that. And so we've really made a big investment in that in the last couple of years. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you all. So Angie, you brought up Facebook and social media a little bit, and I'd like to dig down a little bit more in that. Obviously, Facebook has been in the news a fair amount, but for any of you, what role, if any, do you think social media companies should play in sort of reviewing content on their site for factual accuracy? And what challenges do you see in this?
Well, let me start with a little review of the Facebook program, because I find that people often only have a hazy idea of it. The way it works is that Facebook partners with independent fact-checking organizations, not just PolitiFact, but we are one of them. And they provide us content that Facebook users have marked as potentially false, as well as content that their algorithms deem potentially false. We see this list, we look at it, we select things that we think are false, that we feel like are in our subject area, and we fact check it. We post the results on our website with our usual story and sourcing. Then we go back and tell Facebook what we fact checked. It's putting a URL into their system, and then Facebook takes action to depress the false content down people's feeds. And for repeat offenders, there are more steps. So that's how the program works. Facebook is the only major platform that's doing anything like this, and I give them a lot of credit for it because we'd been wanting to fact check content on Facebook, and the only way we had access to it before this program would be if somebody happened to see it and would send us a link. And it wasn't a very good system or a very effective system. Now we fact check lots of false content. Some of these checks are the most popular checks on our site. People are looking for this content. I mean, what I think is happening, we get some content or some traffic from Facebook, but we also get a lot of traffic to these Facebook checks from search. So I suspect that people are seeing things on Facebook or even other social media. They open another tab, they Google it, and our fact check comes to the top, and they get the proper information there. Now, there's nothing like this on Twitter or the other social media platforms. So overall, I think it's been a very positive program. It has really taken the financial incentive of false news. In 2016, we saw a lot of people who were spreading false news on Facebook who were clearly doing it for profit. I think the program has worked well to eliminate that. I think it's increased awareness among Facebook publishers that they do need to be accurate or they're going to be dinged by the fact checkers. The latest controversy has been about political ads, that Facebook does not include ads from politicians or parties in this program due to First Amendment concerns. I understand why they do that, and it does seem to be a piece with how TV networks have handled ads. We recently did a fact check on Elizabeth Warren. She said TV networks would reject these ads that Facebook has accepted. We rated that mostly false. There has been a high-profile case recently of CNN rejecting a Trump ad for factual reasons, but that's very much the exception to the rule. Most TV stations accept the ads whether they're factual or not, and in fact, broadcast networks are legally required to accept these ads. So it is a complicated information universe. I'm not trying to absolve Facebook of all the issues that some people have, but in this case, in our case, working with them has been very positive. We feel like we're debunking false information that the average member of the public wants to know about.
Just a quick follow-up, Angie. So how quickly is this process? So how long is that content up there before it's reviewed? And then also, you know, is it, I'm not sure you said this, is it pulled or is it flagged? What is the process there?
We wish the process were faster. It basically takes a day or two for us to, part of that is because of our standards with fact checking. We have a process where after we report and write an article, it gets edited by an editor, and then it goes through a review process where 2 editors also review it. We're not really willing to compromise that process because we think it's key to our high quality. So it is a little bit of a slow, it's like a 24-hour, 48-hour cycle. And then what was your other question?
Just, yeah, is it flagged or is it pulled?
I mean, that is more Facebook's area. My understanding is that it's depressed onto the news feed. So when you go on Facebook, you get this news feed, and like, let's say there's potentially 2,000 items for you to scroll through. I mean, I think in theory it's infinite, and they just push it way, way down, so you're not going to see it. That's my understanding of it.
So Check Your Fact actually became partner with Facebook earlier this year, I think January or February. And they have a difficult task. You know, you have a lot of misinformation on the platform. What's the best strategy to tackling it? Do you address it at all? And I think they've struck a careful balance. I think, like Angie said, what they do is there are different degrees to which you could address the content. You could remove it if it's false. They don't do that, and I think they deserve credit for that they reduce the distribution of false content on the platform, but they still give users the free choice to share it if they so choose. They'll be alerted that something's false, so we would write a fact check, and we would attach a flag to it, so that if somebody tried to share it, they would just be notified that there's been a fact check written about it, so they can read about it. So I feel like they're walking that careful line of how do we still let users know that something might be false or defamatory or misleading, but not make them feel as though you're censoring content on the platform. Just to give a bit of a feel, a lot of what we'd see in terms of like what is misinformation We were talking about this a little bit earlier before we got up here, is a lot of it is, it's the memification of false information. And so what you'll see a lot of times is images that have been distorted or altered, photoshopped. You'll see fake quotes. I know we talked about a couple of those. We'd commonly see those on the platform. And that's a good thing about the initiative, is that while there are new claims every day, there are grooves, like there are certain claims that appear over and over. So once you've written a fact check, then you can kind of attach that to new content. So it's quotes, a lot of fake photos. I find that the most substantive stuff to fact check are, it's just a graphic and it has text on it and it's making some sort of claim like you might see in a tweet. A lot of times people will just take screenshots of tweets and share it on the platform. They might take something a politician says, put it in a block quote, or take a screenshot and then they'll share it and it spreads that way. And so it's very easy oftentimes to kind of debunk. There are tools we use. There's Google image search you can use to find the original photo of something if it's been doctored with a fake quote. That does sometimes take legwork, but they're actually etymologists who have they study quotes, and there are certain ones we would rely on, and so you can track that down. A lot of it's relying on experts. But the most substantive stuff is where someone's making a claim about immigration, about whatever the topic may be, and it's kind of more of a traditional fact check where you have to reach out to an expert or delve in, and perhaps it's a longer fact check where you're stepping through something.
Do you have any additional thoughts?
Well, the Washington Post is not a participant in the Facebook program. We decided not to participate. So, I can only observe it as an outsider. It does seem to have helped fuel a lot of growth of fact checking around the globe, because Facebook does pay for these fact checks, and particularly in countries such as India, where you actually had violence as a result of fake news or false and misleading news on Facebook. You've seen tremendous growth. I think there are now 12 or so fact-checking organizations in India, and that, they were inspired in part because of the money that Facebook was willing to pay for this. So, it's Facebook has a not the best reputation in terms of the spreading of fake news. Or actually, I hate the word fake news, but anyway, I've fallen into the trap of using it. But at the same time, because they've started this program, they are underwriting fact-checking around the globe. And there was recently a new census taken of the number of fact-checkers around the world that's put out every year by Duke University. It's now over 200 fact-checking organizations. It was only about 50 in 2014. When I started this in 2011, it was just a handful. So it's just amazing to see the growth of fact-checking, and certainly Facebook has helped play a role, both good and bad, in that.
So, two of you work for media organizations, and the Poynter Institute is obviously closely associated with the sort of vitality of media in our public life. So how has the decline in public trust in news organizations, impacted the way you approach fact checking, and how has the public responded to your work more generally?
Well,
It's a great question. The decline in public trust means that all of our reports are scrutinized extraordinarily heavily, with people looking for things that they can criticize or say we missed something or got something wrong. Sometimes I have people ask me, well, who fact checks the fact checkers? And my answer is everybody on the internet fact checks us. So, I think I've seen the decline in public trust. It wasn't great when I started in journalism in 1994. It's definitely gotten worse. I think one thing, it makes the day-to-day work a little bit harder, but I think it makes the fact checks better in that we have a more acute sense that we are going to be critiqued for everything that we do, and we have to practice our craft at the very highest level to avoid criticism. And even then, criticism will come. So it is a time to be very mission-driven. And as much criticism as we get, one of the things that I find very inspiring is I also get emails from people who say, thank you so much for what you're doing. It's so important. More organizations have been doing fact-checking, and I think it's because it's a simple audience issue. They see that people are going to these fact-checking reports, because I believe that people feel so inundated with information when they're presented with a report that simply says, here are the facts as best as we could ascertain them. They're very much attracted to that. They see it as very necessary to the journalism that we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue we sometimes face with fact checks is people may not be a regular reader of what we do. They're just going to see that particular fact check, and they can get very exercised if we're goring the ox that they support. I once had an instance where a man wrote me an email and said, "Oh, you're just some liberal hack. How could you write this about," I forget who, Mitt Romney? And I wrote back and said, "Look, do me a favor, read the fact checker every day for 30 days, and then tell me what you think." And he wrote back to me after 30 days and said, "You know, I withdraw my objection. You're tough on everyone. I can't figure out," because I always say to people, you cannot discern my personal politics from the fact checks I write. It's just not, if you read it every day, you will not be able to tell. And and generally when people read it every day, they come to that conclusion. I do find that the one trend that, it's one thing if people attack the Washington Post or the New York Times or something like that. One trend that I've noticed that I think is inspired in part by the president is that there's now directed personal attacks on individual reporters, not just the institutions. And the president in his Twitter feed calls out reporters by name. And lately I've been under very strong personal attack from Bernie Sanders supporters who for some reason think that we're unfair to Bernie Sanders when all we're doing is writing fact checks about what he says, and they don't like the conclusions that we've come to. So the personalization of the attacks is a new trend, and I foresee that as probably only getting worse.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
It's worth pointing out that in terms of the, again, communication or political science literature, looking into the way people respond to fact checks, there are some studies, right, that show some limited success, right, in terms of changing people's minds and becoming more accurately informed. Not many, right, but a little bit, sometimes to some small degree. But there are also some instances, and some of you probably instinctively know this or may have heard of this. There are examples of it boomeranging, right? That people believe something that is false. They read the fact checker on the Washington Post pointing out that it is false, and they actually dig in, right? They actually become even more hardened in their belief of that false thing than they had been prior to being exposed to the fact check. There are also examples of people accepting the fact check and saying, okay, well, I guess I was wrong, right? And like in the moment, accepting the conclusion. But then when you ask them a week later, they're right back to where they were, right? So they call that belief echoes, where it's really, really difficult to ultimately change people's minds, right?
Right. I mean, I think if I can just jump in on that. I mean, my feeling, I can't get too exercised about that.
Right.
It's, you know, all we can do is, yeah, well, I don't expect fact checks to change the behavior of politicians. We don't write fact checks to change the behavior of politicians. And we don't necessarily write fact checks to change anyone's minds. It's just the facts are out there. You try to do the best job you can. The fact check goes out on the internet. It will live out there forever. And people, we give a tremendous amount of traffic just from people Googling for information and coming across old fact checks. So, it's like I view each fact check like a little duckling that I've put onto the stream, and they'll go off, and I don't know what is really going to happen to them, but hopefully,
Yeah, I just think it's worth, it's an interesting and noteworthy point that at this point in our polarized environment that to a lot of folks, if Glenn Kessler says that something is false, then that's further validation that it's true.
Just to piggyback on that, I do think when we would write fact checks, it's easy to become disheartened if you look at the social media comments once you post it on social media. But you have to remind yourself that, at least the way I look at things, is that there are a lot of reasonable people out there, and the most polarized, although we've become polarized, the loudest voices are the most partisan. And so I think the value of fact checking is not so much, I don't think you can necessarily convince somebody who is entrenched in a certain worldview to alter their view. But I do think there are a lot of independents. I think there are a lot of moderate Democrats. I think there are a lot of moderate Republicans who are receptive to a fact check. And that's, when I would write a fact check, that's who I'd be thinking of. I think you can change hearts and minds in that way. And you may not even be wholesale changing what somebody thinks about something. You're not what it really comes down to is there's nuance. Fact checking is all about nuance. And so just someone might read an article and they'll come away with a slightly more nuanced view of a situation. And so that's really the most you can hope for, is that it's educational, it's informative, and it kind of chips away. If there's some narrative and it's not true, that you're kind of setting the record straight with each little fact check. Yeah.
Oh, I just remember there was an ad guy who famously said, you're not doing your job if you don't get 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post.
So we can't have a whole debate about fact-checking and not at least bring up Donald Trump. I think, Glenn, you mentioned that he's at now, as of like maybe a week ago or so, like over 13,000 misleading or false claims, which I assume is some sort of record. But there's actually an incredibly interesting poll that the New York Times just released of swing state voters. They found about half of these voters think that the president's conduct is actually pretty typical of what all politicians do, rather than being something that's atypical. So, given the stats I said earlier, but from Gallup, we're saying there's a kind of near universal, at least suspicion of politicians. I was actually surprised, Glenn, when you said that some politicians didn't want to be called out for getting their Pinocchios. But I was wondering if you had seen that, and are we going to see a shift where politicians sort of get resistant to even caring about being called out for telling fibs?
Well, I actually think in politics, every action prompts a reaction. So, I mean, what I view is the Democrats not wanting to end up with a lot of Pinocchios is a reaction to the fact that Donald Trump has earned more than 1,000 Pinocchios, or whatever the count is now. So it's just like Jimmy Carter after Nixon, was running around saying, "I'll never lie to you." The next president, I might be wrong, but I think the next president, whoever that is or whenever that happens, will want to set themselves apart from their predecessor. I mean, look at a lot of what Donald Trump does is to react to what Obama did. So if Donald Trump is famous for not really telling the truth on a consistent basis, the next president is going to make a big show about how they're going to be open and truthful and honest. And you see that with the Democrats as they campaign. I mean, Kamala Harris often says, "Let's speak some truth." It's just the way politics works. So I'm not that fearful of the post-Trump era, because I think it's just natural politics that it's the way the pendulum swings. The bigger issue out in the post-Trump era is the kind of the institution norm shifting that he has tried to accomplish, and whether or not the next president decides to try to take advantage of some of that. It's not going to be so much whether or not they tell the truth, but do they see, gee, these are boundaries that I'm no longer bound by that previous presidents felt they were bound by.
What's really interesting, though, is a lot of conservatives don't, although the president has a reputation for saying a lot of falsehoods, there's this weird divide where Trump's critics point to the number of falsehoods he's uttered, whereas conservatives, they kind of feel like he's very truthful in a certain sense.
Well,
they think he's, so the claims that he states are demonstrably false, but a lot of times they like the fact that he's unvarnished. They like the fact that he wears his heart on his sleeve. And so I think that's part of why he retains such a large support, is that despite the fact that he might be telling you something incorrect, I think there's a certain segment of the population that feels as though, whereas a lot of politicians are glib and they're going to lie or at least stretch the truth, but do it in a very respectable way, that Donald Trump, he'll utter something that's false, but you'll know that if he's expressing his opinion on something or if he's sounding off on Twitter, that's his actual view on it.
Well,
so there's maybe a bifurcation between his views on something and the stats or the claims he's using to support that view.
Well, it gets to the two realities. I think the secret sauce for Donald Trump in 2016 was that he said things that sounded truthful to his supporters. He said things that other candidates weren't saying. So he would say, there are millions of illegal aliens flooding our borders. You can fact check that, it's not true. But his supporters, the people that he was reaching, they believed it to be true. So they said, finally there's a politician telling the truth. Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz never would have gone out and said there were thousands of Muslims applauding the collapse of the Twin Towers, because it didn't happen. But there were lots of people, and I know this from the communications I had with readers, who thought they saw a video on Fox that showed Muslims cheering. Turns out it was two women in Gaza. But they thought these were Palestinians in America. So there again, Donald Trump, in their mind, was telling the truth. So, and he would go where other traditional politicians wouldn't go. So, it gets exactly to what your book talks about. It's like this reality, to those people, he sounded truthful.
And do you feel as optimistic?
I feel like we're at a moment of profound uncertainty, and I feel like Donald Trump is a very unique politician. I've just never seen anybody who speaks the way he does, the way he is so spontaneous with his remarks. He doesn't seem to use research or anything scripted. He just says what he thinks. He says a lot of things that are inaccurate. I just, like, when I try to think of somebody else who's like that, it fails. It fails me. I can't. And in fact, if you looked at Hillary Clinton's record on our Truthometer, it looks a lot like Jeb Bush's. And I would say those are two politicians of different parties, but who had similar temperaments of being highly educated, very cautious, quick to draw on research. So I don't think it's particularly partisan. It seems to be more of a temperament thing. And now we're in this strange place where Trump seems to be basing some of his actions on things that are not reality, like looking for this server in Ukraine that is, there's no way that it's there. And then the decision about removing troops from Syria, like, was that based on evidence? Was that based on an analysis of evidence and a review? So I think as the leader of his party, how the party reacts to that is going to be very interesting. And I have no idea. And I get asked all the time, like friends and family are always asking me, who's going to win the next election? Will Trump get reelected? And it's like, I have zero idea. Zero. I feel like we're at a moment where anything could happen.
I'm a pollster and I avoid that question.
So, funny thing about Jeb Bush, he was such a nerd that his campaign actually had a wall which was adorned with their favorite fact checks.
Yeah, we fact checkers are subject to a lot of partisan attacks, but I just have to say, I don't think of it as a partisan endeavor. I wish more Republicans would work with us on our fact checks. We always contact the person we're fact checking. They have the opportunity to promote evidence. And I get kind of bothered because I see the Democrats saying, like, well, we pride ourselves on our accuracy. Well, accuracy, and that's how we're different from Republicans. That should not be a partisan thing. And when people try to make it partisan, like our party is truthful and that party's not, like you were saying, it's not a good dynamic for governing.
And frankly, what I've learned, politicians will, if they think they have a line that moves voters, even though they know it's inaccurate, they're going to say it anyway. And it doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican. That is just the nature of politicians.
So aside from simply doing more of it, more fact-checking, are there things that can make fact-checking more effective? I know CNN now does in real time fact-checking during video conferences, that kind of thing.
I think the credibility of fact-checking is the most important thing. Obviously there's been an erosion of public trust, and since fact-checking is part of that media ecosystem, it's the question of how do we kind of dig our way out and focus on what can we do to instill trust in the readers. And I think making sure that you represent, if something is false, like I spoke about earlier, but there's some perspective that belongs in the piece, I think a reader is going to be a lot more sympathetic. If they feel like you're representing their both views, but their view in a piece, then they'll feel like you're giving a fair treatment to the issue. And so it's very important not to leave out. You have to be very delicate and careful about making sure all necessary context is in the piece, that sort of a thing. And because I think, to what you said a little bit earlier, I think people, it's almost like an identity now. And so if you're a conservative, if you're a liberal, then there are certain figureheads, there are certain there are celebrities on the left and the right. The readers almost feel personally attacked. Yeah. And so giving it a fair treatment and being assiduous about that is how you build credibility.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point that I totally agree with and endorse. I also worry about people who are not reading, voters who are not reading. We get a certain amount of traffic to our fact checks, but I know a lot of the audience wants to watch video. They don't want to read. I give Glenn and the Post a lot of credit. I think PolitiFact could be better if we did more videos, and we're working on it. But it's very tough. It's a resource-intensive thing. Right now, our fact checks, they're very wordy. They're for people who like to read. I like to read. So that's the area that I've been thinking about lately.
Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, I mean, the video has been, that's really helped build our franchise and have reached that I think has impact. The one thing that my dream, this is not about my fact-checking operation, but my dream is actually if the networks were to take a little bit more responsibility with fact-checking, and after a debate, rather than have all those stupid talking heads sitting around pontificating of who won or who didn't, actually immediately afterwards have an instant fact check of what the candidates did. This is what they do in Spain. There's a really excellent Spanish network that does fact checking, and as soon as the debate is over, they have a half-hour show which says, here's what they said, and here's what was right, here's what was wrong, and they fact check it, and then they get into the political spin. Now, that's a dream. It's like probably a pipe dream, but that would be.
And you couldn't use the same people because none of those talking heads know.
Right. But CNN has actually spent devoted a lot of resources to build up a pretty decent fact-checking organization. Their fact checks after the debate kind of run online, but just get them on right afterwards, and we can wait for Paul Bagala and the rest of the crew for 30 minutes later.
So I would say, and this speaks to a little bit of what I was talking about up here, I don't know in the Trump era how much credibility AEI has with the right anymore. But at least if organizations like AEI, right, that are traditionally associated with the ideological right and the Republican Party, could partner, right, with other organizations, maybe like Brookings, right, that are also reputable but viewed as aligned more with the ideological left or center left, and do joint fact checking like that, there might be some value there, because again, the whole problem is that again, I'm not sure about a lot of the folks in this room, but many people in the quote unquote new Republican Party not only do they not believe anything that Glenn Kessler says, they actually view it as confirmation, right? That it's
They believe what I say,
right? But and on the flip side, right? On the flip side, there are lots of people on the left that aren't going to believe any word that comes out of anybody's mouth, right, on Fox News or maybe for even Cato or AEI or whatever. And so if you can get organizations that again have reputability with their particular constituencies, and those constituencies believe and trust, and partner them up, then we might have more opportunities rather than relying on the traditional sources, which are universities and media, which people like frankly don't trust us anymore.
All right, well, I think we're going to turn over to some questions from the audience now. So the first one back in the corner.
Joseph Schultz, Scripps. I am curious, do you ever audit yourselves for partisanship?
I'm sorry, can you just hold on one second for a microphone? We have an online audience as well. Thank you.
Hi, name's Joseph Schultz, Political Analytics Advisor with Scripps. I am curious, do you audit yourselves for partisanship at all? I'm thinking in terms of partisanship, it could be topic selection, could even be word choice within the fact check itself. Also just straight up, true, not true distributions.
Well, we are, I mean, I don't think, in terms of audit ourselves, you mean go back and review like how many fact checks we did of Democrats and Republicans?
So when I talk about a partisanship audit, there are a number of levels that can be a part of. What you talk about, like true, not true on a partisanship split, absolutely. Could also be what topics you select to review. It could also be something simple like what sort of language is used in the fact check, and is that associated with a partisan side, one side or the other. One thing we see in news, a lot of people who are in the news industry tend to be liberal, and the word choice used can often signify a partisanship alignment.
At PolitiFact, we have done a language audit, and we published the results online, and they did not find any bias. They looked for similar language, repeated words. They did that sort of analysis on our database, and they didn't find anything. As far as the other question that I get from the public is, why are you fact-checking more Republicans than Democrats? Because if you look at the numbers, we have fact-checked more Republicans than Democrats. Part of that is driven by the fact that we have partnerships in states where there is Republicans control most of government. So Florida, Texas, until recently Wisconsin. Part of it is driven by we do not select a random sample of statements to fact check. It would be boring if we did. Mm-hmm. We fact check statements that are in the news and sound wrong. So because we're not doing a random selection, it's really hard to do any sort of audit on topic selection.
We write about, topics that matter, and often the news is in what's in the news. And often news is driven by the people that are in power. I always joke that divided government is better for fact-checking. Mm-hmm. It was actually a bit of a drag the first 2 years of Trump's presidency because the Republicans controlled literally everything. And we respond also a lot from readers. And so readers would hear Mitch McConnell say something, or Paul Ryan say something, or Donald Trump say something, and say, is this true? And they were the only people that were talking. The Democrats were talking, but their statements didn't get as much news coverage. So now that we have divided government again, and also the Democrats are all running for president, the balance this year has significantly changed from what it was in the first 2 years. But like I said when I said in my introduction, we don't really look at who's saying the statement. We're looking at the statement, is this an entree for us to write an interesting article about healthcare policy or tax policy or foreign policy? It's really, the statement is an entree to write about, to help demystify something about the policy process in Washington. So, but, we have a president who dominates the media landscape, and, he won't stop talking. I mean, the amount of words that he says every single day is rather astonishing, since I have to read it all for our database. So, and that's another factor that we have to deal with. I recently looked, if you were to take Donald Trump out of our database, I'm pretty sure Republicans and Democrats would be rated almost equally in the fact checker. But you have to take Donald Trump out, because he completely messed the whole system up.
One final thing to note as far as an audit goes, each of the fact checkers here, both Check Your Fact, PolitiFact, and Washington Post, are accredited with the Poynter Institute. And they go through an actual audit every year with the Poynter Institute, where they check to make sure that your sources are reputable, that your actual content is balanced, that in terms of topic selection, that you're not focusing, on Republicans to the exclusion of Democrats and the other way around. So while it may not be a formal process internally, being a partner with Poynter means that there is a level of accountability there in terms of that annual audit.
Just a little more specificity about that Poynter's role. It's through the International Fact-Checking Network, which created a code of principles, and there's a board of fact checkers who look at all the applications, and it's an international board. So fact checkers from around the world are looking at.
And we should disclose, Angie and I are both on the board.
Yes.
And so we review the applications and vet them, except when we come up ourselves.
If I could just say, even though I don't think your question is really directed at me, I think it's relevant, right? Because people, and indeed academics, universities should certainly audit themselves for partisan bias, since most academics are indeed liberal. One of the virtues that we think of this book and the process that we went through of writing it is that the two co-authors, myself and Morgan, come from opposite sides of the ideological spectrum. I guess I'll just go ahead and reveal it. Not only is Morgan a conservative, he's a Trump conservative. And so through the 5 years that it took of writing this book, we were routinely auditing ourselves and arguing and debating. And so that process, we think, ultimately produced a fair product.
I wouldn't have expected the baseline for topic selection to be 50-50 partisan. I would have expected it to be based on whatever is out there in the news. So thank you.
Yes, gentleman up front.
Hi, my name is Ron O'Kelly, member of AEI. I have a question on your fact-checking. Do you, in fact, look at advertisements? And here I'm talking about something that the Washington Post does. I'm a reader of the Washington Post. We have a weekly China news supplement, which I think is actually something that's done by the Chinese government. And it says advertisement on it. It's every Wednesday, though, so it looks like it's a periodical. And could you address that in terms of the broader aspect of fact-checking?
So you're asking, have we ever fact-checked the propaganda that the Chinese put in the Washington Post on Wednesdays? What?
Any advertisement, I think.
Oh, so read that China supplement. We have not fact-checked that. Frankly, I never really look at it. I see it there and I throw it away. But maybe I should pay more close attention to it. Occasionally, I mean, we do fact-check political ads. We fact-check ads and statements made by advocacy groups. I think on occasion it might have been something that appeared as an ad in the Washington Post. I've been tempted at times to, we sometimes have on the website some sponsored content, and I've been tempted to fact check that. But frankly, every time I saw something that might be interesting to delve into, something else came up and we didn't get around to it. But it got to a point, at one point I did give the editors a heads up. I think I'm going to fact check this sponsored content that someone is paying to put on the Washington Post and said, okay, whatever. But then I didn't get around to doing it. It certainly, I mean, again, like I said, I view all this stuff as an entree to, can we write about an interesting policy issue? So it would have to be something compelling enough that we can delve into and talk about.
We fact-check TV ads for political campaigns especially, and there's so many ads, so you kind of have to triage them as to which are the most high profile. During the last election cycle, we had a partnership with the Internet Archive where they were collecting TV ads off of cable boxes. It was a powerful partnership. We could see which ads were being placed most often in the major media markets. We don't have this program for 2020, so that's troubling. I would love to be able to do a project where we fact-checked all the ads. Even some of them don't really make factual claims, but we still get people asking us if they're true. So it would be good to give a factual evaluation of all the campaign ads, but it's a resource issue. We have 11 journalists at PolitiFact, more than Glenn has, and we still can't get to everything.
Right. I mean, one of some of my favorite fact checks of political ads are the ads that the campaigns don't announce, because often they will put it out. But the really bad ads are ones that they try to put under the radar. And, and so readers will shoot a video off their TV screen and send it to us. And then we can, and we've done some really good, I remember in particular, Alison London Grimes, when she was running against Mitch McConnell, Kentucky, she had a really pretty sleazy ad that she was running just in coal country and thought no one would see except the people in coal country. But someone there, luckily a loyal reader of the Washington Post's website shot it off their TV and sent it to me and said, "Is this possibly true?" And it became a great For Pinocchio piece. So.
Yes.
Professor Barker, a question for you about the students that you're teaching. How are you helping them look into fact-checking, finding out the news, finding whether it's true or not?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and something that I think all of us talk about, think about, and frankly struggle with. I mean, universities are supposed to be these places where people are exposed to diverse points of view and can, again, deliberate and come to new perspectives and new ideas. And that, of course, as we talked about before, depends on accurate information. Part of the challenge, right, is that is frankly, again, polarization, because most, at least at where I work, right, the university classrooms are overwhelmingly dominated among the student body by one particular point of view. And I think you all know which point of view that is. And they often react quite viscerally and emotionally and angrily if you try to offer them some nuance or some suggestion that maybe they should think more carefully about some of those statements. And so I try to do that. Again, I teach courses on media and also on parties and also on ideology. And like the theme in all these courses is to try to understand where your so-called political adversaries are coming from and to respect those points of view. And that has become increasingly difficult over time. But to more directly address your question, right? We try to, I at least expose people to, first of all, I ask them to read the news and I ask them to expose themselves to different sources of information, right, across the spectrum, right? And so that would include news magazines and periodicals, right, like Foreign Affairs as well as Mother Jones, right? And so secondly, we will take information from these sources. And so in terms of the stuff that I give them to read, right, I ask them to look at stuff from across the spectrum again and to evaluate it all critically, right, and try to get them to recognize when people from sources that they trust, right, are being a little bit shady, right, and not just those sources that they don't trust. But at the end of the day, like as I was alluding to before, I'm not sure how successful any of these efforts are. I mean, I think I said in the presentation that education, right, does teach people how to think critically, but what that often does is it teaches people how to be really, really critical of the stuff that they don't like, right? And so it actually tends to exacerbate the problem. And again, we find that people with the highest levels of education are the most likely to project their values onto their factual beliefs. And so I don't have any idea what the solution is to this problem. We wind up reaching very pessimistic conclusions in the book, or we basically say, like, we're all screwed. And that's all I really have to say about that. Yeah.
Well, on that very pessimistic note, we'll call a wrap. Join me in giving our round of hand to our panelists.